Welcome back. We're talking about Greece's debt crisis. Joining us from Athens is economist James Galbraith. He's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. With us here in Washington is Constance Baroudos. She's a policy analyst with the Lexington Institute. And joining us from Dublin is a chief economist at the Institute of International and European Affairs, Dan O'Brien. Welcome to all of you again. James Galbraith, we just heard there the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang talking about the Greek debt crisis, wanting to see an early resolution of this. Is there a role for China on this? China was behind the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the AIIB, reputedly a competitor to the World Bank and the IMF. Can China play a role here?
Well, China does have important interests in Greece. It is a Chinese company that is in line to take over the operation of the port of Piraeus. And so there is certainly an interest there. But I think the most important thing that the great powers around the world can do is precisely in line with what the Prime Minister said, which is to urge the creditors to be flexible and sensible and to come to a pragmatic solution. That's also been the position of the United States government, and I think the more that that's heard, the better off the world and in particular Greece and Europe might be.
And James, you also wanted to respond to Dan O'Brien's comments on what you said earlier.
Yes, this is on the question of austerity. I think the point to emphasize here is that the degree of austerity inflicted on Greece after 2010 has no parallel, certainly in the developed world. And it's therefore not surprising that the Greek economy essentially collapsed under the strain. So whatever one thinks about austerity in general and whether there are some successes someplace, it clearly failed here. And the issue really is whether Europe needs to have economic policies that are suited to the conditions of its particular member countries, rather than imposing the same remedies on them all, in spite of their economic state. Greece desperately needs a different set of remedies, and that's clear to every economist. I don't know of any serious economist who takes issue with that point.
Okay, Dan, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that very briefly, if you could, please.
Well, look, one option would be for a solidarity tax in Europe, in the Eurozone, for everyone in the Eurozone to pay a little bit more tax and for that to go to Greece. That would reflate the economy. It could go into infrastructure. It could go into hiring more public sector workers. It could go into higher pensions. That would certainly work. The Greek economy would grow. But would it be sustainable? One. Two, are the rest of the citizens of the Eurozone prepared to do that? I very much doubt it, and their governments don't appear to be ready to do that. So the political reality here is that if Greece is to have a different type of economic policy assistance, it will involve greater generosity from other countries, and it just does not seem to be, reading the mood across the Eurozone, that the taxpayers of the rest of the Eurozone and their governments are prepared to do that. That just strikes me to be a hard political reality.
Constance, Greece now has a left-wing government, as we've been talking about. Alexis Tsipras campaigned on the anti-austerity platform. In a sense, when we look at this, when we look at the German view of this, is this more about politics than economics?
I think it's about what's doing right for the Greek people. So his platform was no austerity measures and we can stay in the euro. The Greek people do not want austerity measures. They do want to stay in the euro. So it aligns with what the people want. However, the fact that he wasn't able to reach a decision in the negotiations, the fact that he called Alexis Tsipras called a referendum days before the payments due, it really questions his leadership skills. The average Greek citizen in Greece now is upset. They chose Tsipras to negotiate, to make a decision, and now he's dividing the country between yes and no.
James Galbraith, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, on both points. First of all, on the negotiations, Alexis Tsipras was in Brussels when he came to the conclusion that he was not getting any responsiveness from the creditors. The Greeks had made many concessions over weeks and months between February and the end of June in the hope that at the last minute the creditors would meet them part of the way. It was only at the point where Tsipras was driven to the realization that that wasn't going to happen that he felt he had to call the referendum. That was not something that he could have done earlier. On this other question of what could be done in Europe, the Greek proposal actually has nothing to do with taxing the rest of the European taxpayers. It has to do with taking, first of all, taking away the so-called securities market program bonds that the European Central Bank holds, having those basically retired with a new loan from another European financing mechanism, the ESM. And if that were done and done correctly, then Greece could be, the ECB would be in a position to take its boot off of the neck of the Greek banking system. The banks could reopen under some conditions of stability and confidence, and the ECB could bring Greece under its program of quantitative easing. And all of that would stabilize the financial situation of the Greek government fairly effortlessly if the European creditors were willing to do it. But they're not willing to do it because basically they don't want to concede to any of the government's position with respect to low-income pensioners, to respect to labor rights, with respect to the structure of the privatizations program. And so those policy differences basically are the stubborn fact that is keeping the Greek economy completely off balance, and in fact, at the moment, shutting it down. It's not something that's coming out of Greece, it's something that's coming out of Frankfurt, Brussels, and Berlin.
Dan O'Brien, isn't there something of an irony in this? Because if we look at Germany itself, in the aftermath of the Second World War, in 1953, when Germany was actually at that point known as West Germany, and there was an East Germany as well, it was the recipient of bailout funds at that point. One of the creditors was none other than Greece. And there came a point where Germany couldn't pay those funds back. That debt was forgiven, and what remained was restructured. Germany seems to have forgotten about that. It's being very tough on Greece right now.
Well, let's say that there has been enormous changes to the structure of Greek debt, that 20 years ago, the servicing costs of Greek debt amounted to 12% of GDP. They're now down to 4%. And that's because even though the debt is much better, there have been repeated changes to the servicing terms of the debt to reduce it. So other countries will say that they have already made efforts to help Greece in that way. Now, my personal view is that we need to make more effort to do that, but there has to be an acceptance by Greece that it will make greater reform efforts itself. Politically, it simply won't wash, not only in Germany. Let's recall, there are 18 other members of the Eurozone. This is not only something about Berlin. If you go to the Baltic countries, if you go to Slovenia, if you go to Slovakia, these countries are all poorer than Greece even now. They make the point, why should we, as poorer people than the Greeks, subsidize and help the Greeks? That is a point that's made across the Eurozone. It's very unusual in Europe to get 18 countries in agreement. 18 countries are in agreement that Greece has to do as they are proposing, and that is where we are. And you may economically debate it, and reasonable people can do that, but the political reality this weekend is there's a strong signal being sent to Greece that patience has run out after 5.5 years. If this is a no vote on Sunday, then a political decision will be taken to push Greece out of the Eurozone.
James?
Actually, there are 19 countries that agree that the European taxpayer should not be subsidizing the Greek taxpayer. And the 19th country is the government of Greece. It is not asking for a single euro of additional assistance. What it is asking for is what should have been done in 2010, which is to write down or restructure, reprofile in a sufficiently effective way the debt that was not effectively restructured, as Dan O'Brien has said, and which has gone up as a share of Greek GDP because the Greek GDP has collapsed under the burden. The other issue here is who is right about what sort of reforms to propose. The Greek government is an extremely reform-oriented government. It wants to go, it is going after the high-end taxpayer, is going after the tax evader, it is reforming its public administration, but it is not inclined to call reform, let's say, a cut in the pensions of people who are making earning 360 euro a month, the lowest pension that's out there, and that's what the creditors have been asking for. It's not inclined to say that the abolition of collective bargaining is is a reform in violation of standards achieved and respected everywhere else in Europe. That's what the creditors are asking for. So even though 18 countries may be saying, well, we're going to back up the technocrats and the ideologues in their position, it's fully within the rights of the Greek government to disagree on these points. And I think the people of goodwill, people who respect democracy, and economists who understand these matters will all agree that on this point, the Greek government is objectively in the right.
Constance, do you agree that this current Greek government is reform-oriented, or is it a case of how one defines reform?
Well, Greece definitely needs a reform. No one's denying that. In particular, what's caused the debt is political corruption, tax evasion, and a bloated public sector. There needs to be reform. But it cannot reform if it's constantly strapped with these austerity measures. It needs some room to breathe. And I'd also like to make a point in regards to the referendum. Regardless, a week is not enough to educate the people. The people, I'm speaking with people in family, friends, and other people in Greece. They don't understand what the referendum is saying. Some think yes means they stay in the euro, no means we do not stay in the euro, when in fact it's actually about the bailout package from a week ago. That's moot. That's not even applicable anymore. And not just that, but they're not understanding the basic. If you see the actual language of the referendum, it's actually very confusing as well. I think it's going to play out. I think the lack of education of the Greek citizens can definitely play a major role because they didn't have enough time to look at the details.